It's time for an apology.
Why? What did you do?
No, not from me. The apology should come from the Australian mainstream press. The same press that told you Australia's banks were strong and had the best regulation in the world. But an apology also needs to come from the banks who claimed things were different here. That they didn't have the same problems as US and European banks.
Why do they need to apologize? The strong regulation in Australia and the conservative management of Australia's banks saved us. If it wasn't for the government and the banks, Australia would be in the same mess as America.
That's incorrect. 2 years after global financial markets collapsed, a secret bailout of two of Australia's biggest banks has been revealed.
That's not true. I haven't read it in the news.
I know you haven't. You'd think it would be big news. However, there's almost total silence from the banks and mainstream press.
So how did you find out?
I found it out because the United States Federal Reserve recently released some pretty hot material. It was material that proved Australia's banks weren't as strong as the bankers would have you believe.
I don't believe you. The government and banks saved the Australian economy. If what you're saying is right, I would have read it in the papers.
The mainstream press barely reported it. The Fairfax newspapers printed one tiny story about it. The Australian Financial Review didn't cover it at all. The reason they haven't mentioned it is because this news makes them look like fools.
Or maybe it's not that important. You still haven't explained yourself. You're just trying to talk down the Australian economy and the Australian banks.
Actually, it is important. I'm talking about the near collapse of the Australian banking system in 2008. That two Australian banks could have collapsed in 2008 if they hadn't gotten secret loans from the Federal Reserve. National Australia Bank had to borrow $4.5 billion from the Federal Reserve during 2008 and 2009. And Westpac needed over $1 billion in January of 2008 and 2009. But if it wasn't for the passing of controversial legislation in the United States, you'd never have found out these bailouts.
Okay, suppose you're right, so what? Banks borrow money all the time?
Westpac and the NAB needed the loans because they were on the verge of going broke. It's that simple. Also, the RBA borrowed $53 billion from the Fed. But the RBA won't say to which banks it loaned money. And you may never find it out because it's all top secret. It's not even clear if the RBA knew about NAB and Westpac borrowing money from the Fed because the RBA won't reveal what it knew. But not only that, what's most amazing is that Westpac was one of the first banks to borrow money from the Fed when the lending facility became available.
There are other regulators too, such as APRA and the ASX. They would have known about it, and if it's okay with them, it's okay with me.
We don't know if APRA and the ASX knew about it because they won't tell anyone either. Section 56 of the APRA Act forbids it by law to disclose information to the public about the companies it regulates. And the ASX says it's not up to them to decide what's important for the banks to reveal.
How do you know all this?
Because of the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. The legislation included a requirement for the U.S. Federal Reserve to reveal which banks have loaned money to under various bailout programs. One of those programs was titled the Term Auction Facility, which involved the Fed providing loans to banks that were supposed to be in generally sound financial condition.
There you go. It was only for financially sound banks like the NAB and Westpac.
That's not exactly true. Money was loaned to Lloyd's TSB, which got a $10.5 billion loan from the Fed. It was later partially nationalized by the UK government. It also loaned $53.5 billion to Royal Bank of Scotland, which the UK government also partially nationalised. Then there was Allied Irish Bank. Between February 2009 and February 2010, Allied Irish Bank needed $34.7 billion of Fed loans. Allied Irish Bank had all its obligations guaranteed by the Irish taxpayer, and is one reason why Ireland now requires an International Monetary Fund and European Union bailout of $113 billion.
Okay, but those are all foreign banks. Foreign banks weren't as well managed as Australian banks. The government and RBA tells us so.
But Australia's very own National Australia Bank and Westpac borrowed money too. Also, don't forget that the NAB raised $3 billion on the Australian stock market in late 2008. It needed that to bolster its capital. If $3 billion was a big number for the market to know about, then surely the market should have known about the $4.5 billion of Fed loans.
So why did they not say anything?
It was top secret. You didn't hear a word about this at the time. And it didn't stop the bankers, regulators, and politicians from posturing about the stability and strength of Australian banks. In January 2008, Westpac denied there was a problem with its U.S. exposure. That's despite just 1 month before, on December 20, 2007, Westpac had gotten a $90 million loan from the Fed as one of the first borrowers in the TAF program.
Why wasn't his reported? It must be because we're better off not knowing. This should remain a secret. You're behaving like WikiLeaks. You should be sent to jail for writing about this. You're a threat to national security.
No, it's important that taxpayers and savers understand this. Because it's taxpayers and savers whose money is at risk. Keeping things a secret won't help, it'll just make things worse as the bankers and politicians think they can act without you ever finding out. The regulators refused to reveal what they knew about these secret loans. Even though at the time they were talking up the strength of the Australian banking system. Either these regulators deliberately kept this information from the public, or if they didn't know about it then they'd failed in their roles as banking regulators.
You don't understand banking. Banks borrow money all the time. They were just borrowing cheap and lending the money out at a higher interest rate in order to make a profit. I thought you were in favor of free markets and capitalism. You are a hypocrite.
A free market is where there is no interference from governments and central banks. A free market is where the market determines the price of money, not a group of bureaucrats. The NAB and Westpac borrowed from the U.S. Federal Reserve because they had to. Banks borrow money for short-term and long-term durations. If a bank takes out a loan for 30 days, then at the end of 30 days the bank needs to repay the loan or it needs to roll it over to a new loan. Normally, when everyone was happily and foolishly lending money, this was pretty easy. But from 2007 to 2009 the credit crunch occurred and lending ground to a halt.
Yes, I remember that. I couldn't get a 100% loan from the bank. They are bad for not lending money. Thankfully the Australian government gave me free money so I could buy a house.
You shouldn't have gotten those taxpayer dollars. The credit crunch should have been the beginning of the end for the unstable and corrupt banking system. But the central bankers, politicians and mainstream economists thought they knew better. Instead of admitting the dangers of a highly leveraged banking system and allowing it to collapse, they used taxpayer dollars to bail out the banks. Those bailouts have only succeeded in postponing the natural consequence of the credit meltdown. If it wasn't for those bailouts, the banks would have found it hard to borrow the money to pay off the older loans. That's why NAB and Westpac borrowed over $5 billion between them from the U.S. Federal Reserve. Without those loans, the banks wouldn't have been able to meet their obligations to repay short-term funding. And if the banks couldn't repay their short-term funding, they would have defaulted, and you would have seen a run on the banks. That's why the banks took the loans from the Fed and the RBA. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to.
I don't like what you're saying. You are a danger to the economy. It's people like you that short sell stock markets and cause the economy to crash. You should be prevented from saying these things. I'm calling the police.
No, revealing the corrupt and dishonest actions of central bankers, and politicians isn't what causes an economy to be unstable. It is their actions in manipulating economies that causes all the problems in the first place. What is needed is less political and bureaucratic interference and fewer regulations. If the free market was left to decide the level of interest rates, you wouldn't get the kind of painful and dangerous asset bubbles we are seeing now. And if central banks didn't manipulate the supply of money and allow retail banks to create money from thin air, then there wouldn't be any need for Australian banks to secretly borrow money from a foreign central bank. The global and Australian banking system is unstable because of this interference. It's why I choose to insure my assets by buying gold and other precious metals. If you don't want to live in poverty when this Ponzi banking system collapses, I suggest you do the same thing.